people tend to slide right past it. Hildegard of Bingen invented a language. She called it lingua ignota, the unknown language yet, and it contained over 1,000 words. She created an alphabet for it. She wrote glossaries. She appears to have used it in her songs and her correspondence, though scholars disagree about exactly how and why. Some say it was a mystical language, a tongue for speaking to God. Some say it was a secret code for her nuns. Some say it was, and I am not making this up, the earliest known constructed language in European history, predating Esperanto by about 750 years. 1,000 words, an original alphabet, a complete linguistic system, created by a woman in a convent on the Rhine in the 12th century, at a time when most women were not taught to read, let alone encouraged to invent new ways of encoding meaning entirely from scratch. If you have ever met a 12-year-old who spent 6 months building a language for an imaginary world, complete with grammar rules and pronunciation guides, you know exactly what kind of mind does this. A mind that cannot stop systematizing, that finds patterns irresistible, that needs to build structures and fill them with detail, and then needs to build another one. Hildegard's other interests, and I use the word interests in the way that a volcano is interested in lava, included music, botany, medicine, geology, and cosmology. She wrote Physica, a text on the natural world that catalogued plants, animals, metals, and stones. She wrote Causae et Curae, a medical text that covered everything from circulation to psychology to what we would now call gynecology. She composed 77 songs in a musical play called the Ordo Virtutum, the Play of the Virtues, which is the earliest surviving morality play with music. It has 82 melodies. She wrote them all. Historians still argue whether Hildegard's extraordinary productivity was fueled by divine inspiration, by the focused convent environment, or by something neurological, or by a neurological profile that combined hyperfocus, pattern recognition, and sensory intensity in ways that simply could not be contained. The honest answer is probably all of it, simultaneously, because that is how complicated people work, and Hildegard was possibly the most complicated person in 12th century Europe, which is saying something, because 12th century Europe was not short on complicated people. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We're still in the cell with Jutta, and Hildegard is still a child, and she is still keeping her visions secret. And outside the narrow windows the Rhine is still flowing, slow and dark and indifferent, the way rivers always are when extraordinary things are happening on their banks. The secret breaks open in 1141. Hildegard is 42, Jutta is dead, and Hildegard has been elected magistra of the small community of nuns that grew up around their cell. She is in charge now. She has responsibilities, and nuns looking to her for guidance, and the visions will not stop. They have never stopped. For nearly 4 decades she has been seeing blazing, structured, intricate patterns of light, and she's been writing them down in private, and she's been telling almost no one. And the effort of keeping this inside is, by her own account, making her physically ill. So she tells a monk named Volmar, and Volmar, to his eternal credit, does not panic. He does not call for an exorcist, does not suggest she pray harder or eat less, or lie down in a dark room. He says essentially, write it all down, all of it, and let me help. This is, in retrospect, one of the most important editorial decisions in the history of Western literature, because what Hildegard writes becomes Scivia's, Know the Ways, and it is a masterpiece of visionary theology that will eventually land on the desk of Pope Eugenius III himself. You're sitting in the scriptorium now watching her work. The light through the windows is thin and grey. This is the Rhineland, not the Mediterranean. But Hildegard is describing light that makes the sun look like a candle. A living light that suffuses everything and reveals itself in geometric patterns of breathtaking complexity. Circles within circles, flames that do not burn, a cosmic egg, a wheel of fire with a human figure at its centre, arms outstretched, touching the edges of the universe. Modern neurologists have looked at these descriptions and said, with the careful hedge that characterises good science, that sounds a lot like a migraine aura. The scintillating scotoma, the shimmering, often geometric visual disturbance that precedes a migraine headache, can produce exactly the kind of structured, luminous visual phenomena that Hildegard describes. The fortification spectra, the zigzag patterns, the areas of brilliance surrounded by darkness. The neurologist Oliver Sacks wrote about Hildegard's visions with barely concealed excitement, recognising in her 12th century descriptions the precise visual signatures of a neurological event that he had documented in hundreds of 20th century patients. But here is the thing, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, where the easy explanation stops being quite so easy. Migraine auras are usually brief, lasting 20, 30, maybe 60 minutes. But Hildegard describes states of visionary awareness that lasted much longer, that coloured her entire experience of the world. Not painful episodes to be endured, but a fundamental layer of perception. Some scholars suggest what Hildegard experienced was not merely migraine, but something more complex and integral to her entire cognitive architecture. a sensory processing difference that shaped everything she saw, heard, tasted, and thought, a way of being in the world that was, in the most literal sense, genuinely different. And while we are layering hypotheses, this is the kind of story where one explanation sits on top of another like blankets on a cold night. Consider the music. Hildegard's compositions are unlike anything else in medieval music. They use an unusually wide vocal range, sometimes spanning 2.5 octaves, which is wild for plainchant. Her melodies soar and dive and spiral in ways that break every convention of 12th century liturgical music. They are beautiful. They are strange. They are the sound of a mind that processes pitch and pattern differently from other minds, and that cannot be contained within the neat boxes that other composers find comfortable. She did not just write music, you understand. She composed in a way that suggests she heard music as an all-encompassing sensory experience. Her song texts describe sound as light and light as sound, harmony as a physical force binding the cosmos, not metaphor but the literal description of a synesthetic mind, that hears colours and sees sounds and finds the boundaries between senses to be far more permeable than most people find them. Now let's talk about the arguing. Because Hildegard did not simply sit in her convent writing beautiful music and having visions and being quietly remarkable. Hildegard argued. She argued with bishops, she argued with abbots, she argued with the Archbishop of Mainz. She argued on at least one memorable occasion with the Pope. Not a little bit, not politely. She wrote letters of such blazing directness that you can still feel the recipients flinching 800 years later. "You are negligent in your duties," she told one bishop. "You have been lazy," she told an abbot. "The whole church is failing," she told Pope Anastasius IV. And the fact that she phrased it as divine revelation does not diminish the absolute audacity of a nun in the Rhineland telling the Bishop of Rome to get his act together. She also went on preaching tours. Between 1158 and 1170, when she was in her 60s and 70s, in a century where reaching 60 was itself a minor miracle, Hildegard travelled through the Rhineland preaching publicly, a woman, preaching publicly, in the 12th century. This is approximately as expected as a golden retriever delivering a lecture. It was not done. It was specifically, explicitly, theologically not done. Hildegard did it anyway. And this is where the autism question becomes not just interesting but actually important. Because one of the things that characterises autistic cognition, and I am generalising here, and you should always be suspicious of generalisations about any group of humans, but bear with me, is a relationship to social rules that is fundamentally different from the neurotypical relationship to social rules. Neurotypical people absorb social rules unconsciously and follow them automatically. Autistic people often learn social rules explicitly, understand them intellectually, and then make a very conscious decision about whether to follow them at all. The rule exists, it is understood, and then it is weighed against logic, against ethics, against internal conviction, and if it is found wanting, it is set aside. Not out of rebellion, not out of ignorance, out of a genuine inability to prioritise convention over truth. Hildegard knew the rules. She knew women were not supposed to preach. She knew nuns were not supposed to argue with popes. She understood the conventions perfectly. She simply could not bring herself to follow conventions that she believed were wrong. And she had a divine mandate, real or neurological or both, that she held as more authoritative than any human social agreement. The Pope at the Synod of Trier in 1148 had approved her visions. Eugenius III read passages from Civias aloud and declared them genuine. So Hildegard had in effect received the ultimate permission slip from Rome itself, and she used it with an enthusiasm that borders on glee. Historians still argue whether Hildegard's extraordinary defiance was a function of personal courage, strategic genius, divine calling, or a neurological profile that processed the world differently. That simply did not process social hierarchy the way most brains do. And again, the answer is almost certainly all of the above, tangled so tightly that separating them destroys what you seek. She was the Sibyl of the Rhine. She was a doctor of the Church, though that title would not come for another 862 years. She was a woman who saw the universe in blazing light and refused, absolutely refused, to close her eyes. She died in 1179, at the age of 81, and on the night of her death her nuns reported that 2 streams of light appeared in the sky above the monastery, crossing to form a bright cross, which is either a miracle or a coincidence, or the kind of thing that happens when a person's entire life has been so saturated with light that even the sky decides to join in. You choose. Hildegard almost certainly already knew the answer, and now, perhaps, so do you. We leave the Rhine, the convent, the vineyards, and the slow grey river, and walk south into Italy where the sun is harder and the dust is thicker. The religion there is louder, more physical, and considerably more likely to involve a man taking off all his clothes in a public square. Because we need to talk about the holy fools, and to do that we need to talk about Francis of Assisi, and to talk about Francis we need to talk about Brother Juniper. And to talk about Brother Juniper we need to talk about a pig. Specifically, a pig's foot. You are in a Franciscan friary in the Italian countryside. It is the early 13th century. The stones are warm under your sandals and someone is sick. One of the brothers, lying in bed, feverish and miserable. He wants a cooked pig's foot and has mentioned this several times. The other brothers have nodded sympathetically and done absolutely nothing. They are Franciscan friars who own nothing, have no pig, and have more pressing concerns than one man's deeply specific pork-based cravings. Enter Brother Juniper. He's heard about the pig's foot situation and is concerned. The kind of concern that does not pause to consider secondary consequences. This is a trait that will define his entire career as a Franciscan, and provide enough material for what amounts to a medieval slapstick comedy special. Juniper goes to find a pig. He finds one in a field, presumably someone's pig. This does not slow Juniper down even slightly. He has a knife. He has a sick brother. The equation is simple. Sick brother wants pig's foot, pig has feet, Juniper has knife. He approaches the pig. He removes a foot. He leaves the rest of the pig, alive, now extremely unhappy, and conspicuously three-legged. He goes back to the friary, cooks the foot, and brings it to the sick brother with the radiant satisfaction of a man who solved a problem through direct action. The pig's owner is, understandably, furious. He arrives at the friary shouting, calls the friars thieves, calls them liars, calls them names the hagiographers probably cleaned up. The other brothers are mortified. Francis is summoned, and Francis, himself no stranger to dramatic public behaviour, listens carefully to the whole story. Then he does something remarkable. He turns to Juniper and tells him to apologise, not for cutting off the pig's foot, but for upsetting the man. When the pig's owner continues to rage, Francis sends Juniper back out, and Juniper processes the instruction to make it right through a very particular mental filter. Juniper finds the man and tries to convince him that the pig should be glad to have lost a foot for such a charitable cause. He embraces the man, kisses him, and is so overwhelmingly sincere that the pig's owner eventually gives up, slaughters the rest of the pig, and donates the meat to the friars. This is not an isolated incident. This is Tuesday for Brother Juniper. The stories pile up. He gave away his clothes so often that other friars were ordered to stop him. He was found playing on a seesaw in Rome, a grown friar in his habit on a children's seesaw, and when questioned did not understand why this was inappropriate. He once prepared 2 weeks' worth of food all at once, dumping everything into a single enormous pot. Porridge, eggs, vegetables, and scraps. Brother Juniper seemed genuinely confused when the other brothers declined to eat his chaotic stew, staring at the rejected pot with bewildered innocence. He cut bells and silver ornaments off church altar cloths to give to the poor, and could not understand why the sacristan was upset, since the poor clearly needed silver more than any altar did. The other friars called him a lunatic, a disgrace to the order, simple, foolish, a liability. Francis, who talked to animals, threw himself into thorn bushes and reportedly developed stigmata, looked at Brother Juniper and said, "Would to God I had a whole forest of such junipers." A whole forest, not one embarrassing juniper to be tolerated, but a whole forest of them. This is where the concept of holy foolishness becomes genuinely radical. What Francis is saying is that Juniper's literal mindedness, his inability to grasp implied social rules, his tendency to take instructions at face value, these qualities are not flaws, they are gifts. They are, in Francis's framing, closer to God than the smooth social competence of people who always know the right thing to say. Francis called his friars jugglers for God. Joculatores domini. A juggler entertains. A juggler breaks the normal flow of things, throws objects into the air and catches them in unexpected ways. People stop and stare, and for a moment the ordinary rules of the world are suspended, and something playful and strange and free takes their place. The tradition of holy foolishness is older than Francis, going back to Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. We are fools for Christ's sake. It winds through the Eastern Orthodox tradition, where holy fools, a Eurodivian Russian, deliberately behaved in shocking ways, wearing rags, sleeping in streets, shouting prophecies in the marketplace. The holy fool's job was to be a mirror, so far outside the norms that the norms themselves became visible, became questionable, became, just for a moment, absurd. The holy fool tradition created a space, a social, theological, cultural space, in which being profoundly, unmistakably different from everyone around you was not just tolerated, but venerated. If you could not read social cues, that was because you were reading divine ones. If you could not understand why people cared about money and status, you understood something more important. If your behaviour was bizarre and incomprehensible to the people around you, that was because you were operating on a frequency that ordinary people could not receive. Historians still argue whether the holy fool tradition was genuinely accepting of cognitive difference, or merely a subtle form of containment, managing disruptive individuals by assigning them a respected but marginal role. There is real evidence on both sides. Some holy fools lived comfortable lives within their communities, beloved and protected. Others were beaten, imprisoned, or killed. Their holiness was recognised only after they were safely dead. And for someone like Brother Juniper, whose mind worked differently, the Franciscan friary offered something remarkable. It offered a context in which his differences were not just accepted but celebrated, a framework in which his inability to be normal was reframed as a refusal to be worldly. The community looked at his most baffling behaviours and said, yes, more of that, a whole forest of that. Whether Juniper was autistic is a question we cannot answer with certainty. He lived 800 years ago. We have hagiographic accounts, not clinical assessments, but the pattern is there, shimmering under the surface like Hildegard's visions. And it tells us something not just about Juniper, but about the medieval world, that it had spaces for different minds, strange spaces, holy spaces, spaces that came with costs but spaces nonetheless. Now come with me to Norwich. It is the late 14th century, and England smells the way 14th century England always smells, strongly and with great variety and not always pleasantly. You're walking through narrow streets that twist like anxious thoughts, past timber-framed houses that lean toward each other conspiratorially, past a market where someone is selling eels. Someone else is arguing about the price of wool. You're heading for a church, the Church of St. Julian, which sits near the River Wensum. It sits in a part of Norwich that is old even by Norwich standards, and Norwich, as a city, is old by anyone's reckoning. You approach from the north side, and at first it looks like every other medieval parish church. Stone walls, small windows, a tower that does not quite commit to being tall. But on the south side, attached to the church like a barnacle on a hull, there is a small room with 3 windows, one opening into the church. One window opens to a servant's quarters, so food can be passed in and waste passed out. One opens to the outside world so people can come for advice, counsel and prayers. Inside this room, a woman is sitting. She has been sitting here for a long time. She will sit here for a long time more. Her name is Julian. She's writing a book that will not be widely read for another 500 years, and when read, it will prove one of the most extraordinary theological works in the English language. It is called Revelations of Divine Love, and it is the first book written in English by a woman that we know of. There are probably others. History has the memory of a goldfish when it comes to women's writing. But before we talk about what Julian wrote, we need to talk about how she got into this room. The process of becoming an anchorite is one of the most extraordinary rituals in medieval Christianity, and it tells you something important about the relationship between enclosure and peace. The ceremony is, essentially, a funeral, your funeral while you're alive. You attend your own last rites. The bishop performs the commendation of the dying over your living, conscious body. Prayers are said for the repose of your soul. You're sprinkled with holy water. In some accounts, you lie prostrate while the office of the dead is recited over you. You are, in the eyes of the church, dying to the world. The person you were is ending. The person you are becoming, the anchorite, the enclosed one, is being born. And then you walk into the cell, and in some versions of the ceremony, the door is walled shut behind you, bricked up, sealed. You are in. The world is out. You will stay in until you die, at which point the wall opens, your body is removed, the cell cleaned, and eventually someone else will walk in and the wall will rise again. Let that settle for a moment. A person, voluntarily, with full knowledge of what they are choosing, decides to be walled into a small room for the rest of their life. No travel, no variety, no spontaneous decisions, no crowds, no markets, no weather on their face except through 3 small windows, the same walls, the same light, the same prayers, every day. Your first reaction probably is horror, the reaction of a mind that values freedom and movement and novelty and choice. But consider the possibility that for some minds, this is not horror. For some minds, this is relief. Think about what anchoritic enclosure eliminates. Unpredictability, the need to navigate crowds, to read facial expressions, to decode constantly shifting social dynamics. It eliminates the noise of a medieval town, the shouting, hammering, bells, animals and people, always the people, wanting things, expecting things, communicating in ways that are exhausting to decode. Anchoritic life removes all of that. It replaces chaos with order, and replaces the terrifying openness of the world with 3 windows, a set of walls, and a schedule that never ever changes. The Ancrain Vissa, a guide for anchoresses written in the early 13th century, describes the daily routine in detail that borders on the obsessive, and I mean that as a compliment. When to pray, when to eat, when to sleep, how to arrange the cell, what to wear, how to sit. A manual for the most controlled, predictable environment medieval technology could produce. By the 15th century, the anchoritic